Desmond Wade was 38 years old, a structural engineer who had built everything he owned from nothing. The career, the Atlanta home, the marriage he believed in completely. He grew up poor in Memphis and spent his entire adult life making sure the people he loved never felt that weight. For 9 years, he was faithful, present, and steady. The kind of man his wife called boring to her lover, while cashing the joint account he never thought to question. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a rained-out site visit sent him home early. He walked into his own house, climbed his own stairs, and pushed open a bedroom door that was open exactly 4 inches. What he saw on the other side shattered 9 years in seconds. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Because when Desmond didn't run, when he didn't scream or beg or crumble, his wife reached into the nightstand drawer and pointed a loaded gun directly at him, in his house, in his bedroom, with another man in his bed. And standing there in that doorway, staring down the barrel, Desmond Wade made a decision. He didn't know yet how deep the betrayal ran. He didn't know about the $41,000 she had already moved. He didn't know about the secret company, the fraudulent contracts, or exactly how long she had been planning for this moment. But she was about to find out what happens when you underestimate a man who builds things for a living. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm didn't need to wake Desmond Wade. He was already up. 5:13 a.m. He lay still for 2 more minutes the way he always did, staring at the ceiling, running through the day in his head, ordering it, a habit he'd built so long ago he couldn't remember starting it. When the alarm finally buzzed, he reached over and killed it before the second pulse. Adrian didn't move. He dressed in the dark, quietly, and went downstairs. The kitchen smelled like the house always smelled in the early morning. Clean wood, faint lemon, the ghost of last night's dinner already fading into something neutral. Desmond started the coffee, pulled the blueprints for the Morrison Street overpass from his leather portfolio, and spread them across the kitchen table. He anchored the corners with his mug and a small ceramic dish Adrian had bought at a market in Savannah 2 summers ago. He still liked that dish. He worked for 40 minutes without looking up. The blueprints were good work, clean load distributions, solid redundancy in the support columns, but he'd spotted a tension calculation in the secondary beam assembly that wanted another look. He marked it in pencil. Light marks, precise. That was how he worked. Never permanent, until he was sure. Adrian came downstairs at 6:50. She was dressed well. Navy wrap dress, low heels, her hair pulled back the way she wore it on presentation days. She looked polished. She always looked polished. It had been one of the things that drew him to her once, that quality of looking put together, even when life wasn't. He used to find it beautiful. These days he found it hard to read. She kissed his cheek without slowing down and moved toward the coffee pot. "You were up early," she said. "Same time as always." She poured her coffee. Her phone was on the counter beside her, face down, and she didn't pick it up while he was watching. That was the thing. She was careful, had always been careful. He used to think that was just her nature. Private, self-contained. He'd respected it. He still wasn't sure he was wrong to have. "Budget meeting today?" he asked. He already knew the answer. She'd mentioned it Sunday. "Mm-hmm." She was looking at the window over the sink. Not at him. He noticed the perfume then. Not heavy. A soft cloud of something warm and floral that didn't belong at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. She'd worn that perfume the night they had dinner in Midtown for their 7th anniversary. He had a good memory for details. Always had. He said nothing. "Girls' trip this weekend is still on," she said, rolling her phone off the counter and into her bag in one smooth motion. "Probably leaving Friday evening." "That's fine." "You sure? I know you had that." "I said it's fine, Adrienne." She looked at him then. A quick look, almost a test. He met it with a steady, easy expression that gave her nothing. After a moment, she smiled, small, practiced, and picked up her coffee. Okay. She moved toward the door. Don't forget the dry cleaning. The door closed behind her. He listened to her car start in the driveway and back out slowly. Then he looked down at the blueprints. The tension mark in pencil. The thing he wasn't sure about yet. He picked up his coffee. She was 26 when he met her. He was 28. He'd been 2 years out of grad school, working 60-hour weeks at a small civil engineering firm in Midtown, saving aggressively, eating cheap, building toward something he could only see in outline. She was working hospital administration then, already moving fast, already comfortable in rooms that cost money. He remembered thinking she was the most composed person he'd ever been near. Not cold, composed. Like she understood the temperature of every room before she entered it. 9 years. They'd talked about children early on, and she'd said, not yet. And he'd said, okay. And then time had arranged itself around that pattern until it became the pattern itself. He didn't carry resentment about it. He'd told himself it was a shared life, that her pace was their pace. He'd built this house around that belief. 6 years of savings. Every renovation decision run through her first. He kept that thought at a distance now and didn't examine it too closely. At work, Pat found him staring at the same calculation he'd already checked twice. "You're somewhere else today," she said, dropping a folder on the corner of his desk. "I'm here," he said. She looked at him the way Pat looked at things. Direct, unhurried, like she was reading past the surface. She had that quality. Forensic, almost. He'd learned not to underestimate it. "Okay," she said, and let it go. The site visit was canceled at noon. Rain moving up from the south, the foreman said. Nothing to see until Thursday. Desmond closed his portfolio, told Pat he was heading out, and walked to his truck. He drove home through gray October light, the city giving way to quieter streets and older trees. He wasn't thinking about the blueprints. He was thinking about the perfume. He turned into his neighborhood, and his eyes moved, the way they always moved, over the familiar geometry of the street. Same houses, same driveways, same spacing between lots he'd memorized without trying. Then the Porsche Cayenne. White. Parked 2 houses down from his own. He didn't recognize it. He looked at it once as he drove past. Then he pulled into his driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine running. Desmond cut the engine. He sat in the driveway for 10 seconds, not thinking, just listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the low sound of the wind moving through the oak tree at the edge of the yard. Then he got out. The front door was locked, which meant nothing. He used his key. The door opened the way it always opened, smooth, no sound. He'd replaced the hinges 2 winters ago because the old ones squeaked, and it used to bother him in the mornings. He stepped inside. The house was dim. The curtains in the front room were half drawn, the way Adrienne left them when she didn't want afternoon glare on the television. He stood in the entryway for a moment and listened. Music. Upstairs. Soft at first. He almost mistook it for the neighbor's house. But then he placed it. A playlist she kept on her phone. Something with slow bass and low vocals. She played it when she was relaxed, when she felt safe. He stood very still. The house did not feel empty. He moved toward the staircase. He didn't take off his shoes. He didn't call out her name. He went up the way he always went up. Right side of the steps, where the carpet was thick and the boards didn't flex. He'd learned the geography of this house the way he learned every structure he ever worked on. Where the weight settled, where it didn't. The hallway at the top was dark, except for the bedroom. The door was open 4 inches. Light came through the gap. The warm afternoon light that came through the south-facing windows he'd chosen specifically for that room because Adrienne said she wanted to wake up to sunlight. He'd thought about that when they were buying the house. He'd thought about her in those rooms before she ever stood in them. He pushed the door open. The room came into focus all at once. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He took it, in the way he took in every scene that demanded understanding, completely, and without the luxury of denial. The man was someone he didn't recognize. Late 30s, early 40s, big. He had the kind of build that came from a gym and the kind of posture that came from money. He was scrambling backward toward the headboard, one hand pulling the sheet, his face going through several things very fast. Adrian saw Desmond first. He watched her face. First came the shock, a real flash of it, quick and genuine. Then the guilt, moving behind her eyes like a shadow across a wall. And then, and this was the part that lodged somewhere deep and cold inside him, it was gone. All of it. Replaced by something else? Calculation. She looked at him the way she looked at budget shortfalls, the way she looked at problems she'd already thought about solving. She reached into the nightstand drawer. The motion was clean. No hesitation. She'd reached into that drawer the way a person reaches for something they've reached for 100 times in their mind. Her hand found it without looking. She raised it and pointed it at her husband. A gun. His eyes moved over it. Semi-automatic. Compact. Black. His mind registered it the way it registered load-bearing data. Fact. Mass. Weight. Consequence. She held it steady. You need to leave, Des. Her voice was low. Controlled. The same voice she used in meetings when she needed a room to settle down. Not screaming. Not crying. Controlled. He looked at the gun. Then he looked at her face. Then, slowly, deliberately, he looked at the drawer the gun had come from. And something inside him went very, very quiet. Because it wasn't panic. He understood that now, with the same certainty, he understood load calculations. The same certainty that came when he looked at a structure and knew, bone deep, where it would fail. Panic didn't reach into a drawer that cleanly. Panic didn't hold a weapon with two steady hands. Panic didn't keep its voice that low. She had thought about this. Not today. Not in the last 5 minutes. She had thought about this, the possibility of this exact moment, and she had made a decision about what she would do when it came. The drawer was always loaded. The plan was always there. He was looking at a woman he did not know. The man on the bed had gone completely still. Smart enough, at least, for that. Desmond stood in the doorway of the bedroom he had chosen, in the house he had built from nothing, and he looked at his wife and her gun for 3 full seconds. Then he said it. Put the gun away. A pause. I'll be back. He turned around. He walked down the hallway, down the stairs, right side, thick carpet, no sound. Through the front door he pulled shut behind him, softly, the way he always did. He got into his truck. He started the engine. He did not look at the house in the rearview mirror as he backed out of the driveway. He drove. He drove north first, then west. Then he found himself on a stretch of county road he didn't consciously choose, the kind of road that just opens up in front of you and asks nothing, and he let the truck carry him for a while. 40 minutes, maybe a little more. He didn't turn the radio on. Already Park hadn't changed much since he last visited it. That was 6 years ago, maybe 7, back when he was still running numbers in his head every morning, calculating how many more months before he had enough for the down payment. He used to drive out here when the walls of his apartment felt too close, when the weight of wanting something he didn't yet have got too heavy to carry inside 4 rooms. He pulled into the lot. There were 2 other cars, both empty. A walking trail looped around a pond that sat low and still in the late afternoon light. A row of wooden benches faced the water. He picked the one at the far end. He sat down. He put his forearms on his knees, and he looked at the pond, and he breathed. In through the nose, out slow. Once, twice. The way he breathed on job sites when the numbers didn't line up and he needed his mind to stop moving so he could see the problem clearly. He gave himself 5 minutes to feel it. Just feel it. All of it. The image in the doorway. Her face moving through those stages. The shock, the guilt, and then the thing that replaced them both. The hand reaching into the drawer without hesitation. The gun rising steady and level. Her voice telling him to leave. In his house, in his bedroom. Like he was the trespasser. 5 minutes. Then he put it down. He worked the problem. What do I know? He knew she had been in that bed with someone. He knew the man's car. Porsche Cayenne. Dark blue. Georgia plates. Parked 2 houses down. He knew Adrienne had a loaded firearm in the nightstand drawer of their bedroom. He knew she had accessed it without hesitation. He knew her voice was controlled. He knew her hands were steady. What does that mean? It meant the gun was not panic. Panic was loud. Panic shook. Panic was the response of someone overwhelmed by a moment. What he had seen was the response of someone who had already rehearsed the moment, who had asked herself, at some earlier point, maybe many earlier points, "What will I do if he comes home early?" And had answered that question with a firearm and a 2-word instruction. You need to leave. Not please. Not wait. Not even fear behind it. A directive. Like a hospital administrator managing a room. The gun was a plan. That single fact reorganized everything else around it. What are the failure points? The first failure point was time. She had it right now, and he didn't. She was in that house, possibly with the man, possibly already on the phone with someone, an attorney, a friend, someone who would help her build the first draft of a story. Every hour he didn't act was an hour her version of events got more solid. The second failure point was documentation. Every financial record they had was either in that house or in his storage unit on Fulton Industrial. The storage unit had a combination lock. The combination was one he had set years ago. She knew it. He took his phone out. The first call was to a locksmith, not a chain, an independent, a man he had used twice before for job sites. He explained what he needed. The storage unit on Fulton Industrial, the lock changed out today, a new key cut for him only. The man said he could be there within the hour. Desmond said he'd meet him there in 45 minutes and pay cash. He hung up. The second call took him a moment longer to make. Not because he was uncertain, because he wanted to be precise about what he was going to say before he said it. He called the non-emergency police line. He told them his name, his address. He said that earlier that afternoon, inside his residence, his wife had pointed a loaded firearm at him and instructed him to leave the property. He said the incident had occurred at approximately 3:40 p.m. He said he was not injured. He said he was not requesting an immediate response. He said he wanted to make a report. The officer on the line asked him several questions. Desmond answered each one the same way he answered every question that mattered. Factually, without embellishment, without emotion. He gave the description of the man he had seen, the vehicle, the time, the exact words that were spoken. The officer gave him a case number. Desmond wrote it on the back of a receipt he found in his center console. He read it back to confirm it. He thanked the officer and ended the call. He sat there for another moment. The pond was going gray now as the sun dropped. A bird moved low across the water and disappeared into the reeds. Everything from this moment forward was evidence. He understood that the way he understood load-bearing fundamentals, not as a strategy exactly, but as simple physics, the truth had weight. Handled correctly, weight held things up. He started the truck. Uncle Lawrence lived 20 minutes east, in a brick ranch house on a quiet street in Decatur that he'd owned for 30 years. The lights were on when Desmond pulled up. They were always on. Lawrence met him at the door without a word, just held it open and stepped aside. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who had always been careful with themselves, with close-cropped gray hair and the calm eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades reading what numbers actually meant versus what people claimed they meant. He'd worked as a CPA for 32 years. He had seen every shape that financial dishonesty took, and he had learned to recognize the smell of it before he could name the source. He had put a pot of coffee on. He had also, Desmond noticed, cleared the kitchen table. There was nothing on it except a legal pad and a pen, and Lawrence's reading glasses sitting folded beside them. He'd heard the tone on the phone. They sat down. Lawrence poured 2 cups and set them down without asking. He looked at his nephew and waited. Desmond wrapped both hands around his mug. "I need to know everything about our money," he said. "Every account, every transaction. For the last 4 years." Lawrence held his gaze for a moment. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if Desmond was all right. He didn't say a single word that would cost them time they didn't have. He reached across the table, opened his laptop, and turned it to face them both. They worked at the kitchen table for 3 days. Lawrence had a system. He always had a system. He printed nothing until he understood it, and he understood nothing until he had seen it from 3 different angles. He cross-referenced bank statements against account records against the documents Desmond had retrieved from the storage unit, and the storage unit documents against the online access they still had to every joint account Adrienne hadn't thought to lock him out of yet. She hadn't locked him out of anything. That told Lawrence something too. Desmond sat across from him and fed him documents in the order he asked for them. He didn't interpret. He didn't editorialize. He retrieved what Lawrence needed and waited for Lawrence to tell him what it meant. It was the same way he worked with structural reports on job sites. Let the data speak before you form a conclusion, because conclusions formed too early become filters that block out everything that doesn't fit. He drank a lot of coffee. He slept at a hotel 6 minutes away and came back each morning at 7. Lawrence found the transfers on the 2nd day. He didn't say anything right away. Desmond watched his uncle's eyes stop moving across the screen. Lawrence leaned forward slightly and adjusted his glasses. He typed something. Then he went still again. "Come look at this," he said. Desmond came around the table and stood behind him. What Lawrence had pulled up was the joint savings account, the one they used for household expenses, for annual insurance premiums, for the things that didn't fit into monthly cash flow. Lawrence had sorted the transaction history by amount, ascending. There were entries all the way down the list, sitting just below $900. Not exactly 900. Never exactly 900. 870. 843. 891, 860, each one labeled with a notation that meant nothing. A number sequence, like an internal transfer reference. No payee name, no memo. "How many?" Desmond asked. Lawrence scrolled slowly. "I'm still counting." He counted for a while. 22 months. Give or take 1 gap in the middle. A 3-week pause. Right here. He tapped the screen. Then it starts again. Desmond looked at the gap. 3 weeks. He thought back. That was around the time they had gone to his cousin's wedding in Charlotte. They had been, or he had believed they had been, in a better stretch, easy with each other. He remembered thinking things felt lighter. She had paused the transfers for 3 weeks while they were in a good stretch, then resumed when things settled back to normal. He straightened up and walked back to his chair. "What's the total?" he asked. Lawrence typed, looked at the number, typed again to confirm it. $41,230, he said. Over 22 months. The kitchen was very quiet. "Where did it go?" Desmond asked. Lawrence had already started pulling that thread. It took him the rest of that day and most of the next morning, working through a chain of routing numbers and account designations that had been constructed to look like noise. Whoever set it up knew what they were doing. But Lawrence had spent 32 years watching people try to make money disappear, and he knew that money never actually disappeared. It just changed its name. It had gone to an LLC. The LLC was registered in Georgia. The sole member was listed under a name Desmond recognized, Adrian's maiden name. The registered business address was a medical office suite in Buckhead. Lawrence typed the address into a search. The suite was the professional office of Dr. Brett Holloway, orthopedic surgery. Desmond read the name on the screen. He didn't say anything. He sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with a structural discrepancy, before deciding what it meant. "Is Holloway connected to the LLC?" he asked. "Listed as a consultant," Lawrence said. He had found the operating agreement through the state business registry. No ownership stake, just a consulting designation. Lawrence called Pat that afternoon. He didn't give her much, just enough to point her at the LLC and ask her to trace the full paper trail. He told her it was important. He told her to be discreet. She asked 2 questions, got the answers she needed, and said she'd have something by Sunday. She had it by Saturday evening. The LLC had been formed 3 years ago, not 2 years ago, when the transfers started. 3 years ago. A year before the first dollar move. A year of preparation before the first transaction. The operating agreement, the consultant designation, the business address, all of it in place and waiting before a single cent had been redirected. Lawrence laid the timeline out on the legal pad in a single column and set it in front of Desmond without commentary. Desmond read it twice. Lawrence let him. Then he picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and set the mug down. "She wasn't just cheating on you, son," he said. "She was building an exit." That evening, Lawrence cooked. Pork chops, rice, and green beans from a can, which was what he always made when he didn't want to think about food. They ate at the same table where they had spent 3 days dismantling the last 4 years of Desmond's financial life. Lawrence washed the dishes. Desmond dried them. He drove to the hotel. He set the case number receipt on the nightstand. He turned the light off. He did not contact Adrian. He slept. The text came at 7:42 in the morning. "We should talk." Desmond read it once, set the phone face down on the hotel room desk, poured his second cup of coffee from the small machine on the counter, and went back to the window. Outside, the parking lot was filling up. A woman in scrubs walked fast toward a sedan. A delivery truck idled near the entrance. The sky was flat and white, the kind of Atlanta morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. He picked the phone back up at 1:38 in the afternoon. Not yet. He set it back down and returned to the structural report he was reviewing for the Macon project. His red pen moved steadily across the page. Adrienne read the reply and felt something loosen in her chest. Not yet. Not never. Not don't contact me. Not anything from an attorney. Just not yet, which meant he was still processing, still sitting in whatever quiet place he always retreated to when things got hard. She had seen it a dozen times in 9 years, when his firm lost the Gwinnett contract, when his mother got sick, when they argued about the vacation house she wanted and he said the numbers didn't work. He went quiet. He went internal. He waited until he felt steady, and then he came back to the table and they talked it through. That was Desmond. That was who he was. She called Brett from the parking garage at the hospital, away from the building's security cameras, a habit she had developed over the past 2 years. He texted back, she said. 2 words. Not yet. He just needs time to process it. Brett was quiet for a moment. Adrian, he's not the type to escalate. I know him. You had a gun pointed at the man? I know what I did. Her voice stayed even. And I know him. He will want a clean settlement. He will want to avoid drama. That is who Desmond Wade is. Brett exhaled. She could hear him moving, the particular sound of dress shoes on the marble floor of his office. My attorney says I shouldn't be involved in any of this. You're not involved in any of this, she said. Let me handle it. She believed every word of it. That was the thing about Adrienne. She was not performing confidence for Brett's benefit. She genuinely believed that the man who had backed slowly out of his own bedroom was the same man who would eventually sit across from a mediator, sign what he was handed, and leave quietly. She had built 9 years of evidence to support that conclusion. She was certain of it the way people are certain of things they have stopped bothering to question. She went back inside and had a productive afternoon. Pat did not have a productive afternoon. She had been sitting with the LLC documents since Saturday, and something in the structure of it had been nagging at her the way a misaligned column nags at an engineer. Not obviously broken, but not quite right either. On Wednesday evening, she had pulled up the LLC's business registration again and cross-referenced the consultant designation against public procurement records for the hospital system where Adrienne worked. She found it on her third pass, a supply contract, signed 14 months ago, renewed 8 months ago. Medical equipment and consumables, the kind of large-volume recurring purchase that went through a senior administrator's desk for approval. Adrienne's signature was on both the original and the renewal. The vendor's corporate filing listed a holding company as its majority investor. Pat traced the holding company. It took her 2 hours and 3 separate business registry searches across 2 states, but at the end of those 2 hours, she was looking at a clear line from that holding company to a private investment entity that listed Brett Holloway as one of 3 managing partners. She sat back in her chair. Adrienne had not just been routing marital money to Brett's Consulting LLC. She had been using her institutional signing authority to steer hospital supply contracts worth considerably more than $41,000, toward a vendor in which Brett held a direct financial interest. She had done it twice. She had approved the renewal herself. Pat looked up the hospital's funding structure. Federal designations, Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, federal grant classifications. She was not an attorney. But she had spent 6 years in forensic accounting, and she knew enough to know that when a federally funded institution's administrator directs procurement contracts toward a vendor owned in part by her undisclosed romantic partner, the word fraud becomes relevant very quickly. The word federal becomes relevant shortly after. She printed everything. She put it in a folder she called Desmond. Desmond received the folder Thursday morning, delivered by Pat in the parking garage of a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel. He sat with it at a corner table for a long time. He read through the documents carefully. He read them again. He thought about Adrienne in the parking garage at the hospital, wherever she made her calls. He thought about the confidence on her face when she raised that gun. He thought about how certain she must still be, right now, that she had this under control. He paid for his coffee. He walked to his truck. He called Uncle Lawrence first and told him what was in the folder. Then, that evening, he dialed the number for a woman named Judge Carol Whitmore. The attorney's name was Sandra Reeves. Her office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, clean and spare. The kind of space that told you exactly who you were dealing with before she said a word. No soft colors, no decorative plants, 1 framed license on the wall, 1 window behind her desk, 1 chair across from it. She was already reading when Desmond sat down. He had brought everything in a single manila folder. The bank statements Lawrence had flagged, the LLC registration, Pat's procurement research, and a copy of the police report he had filed the evening of the incident. He had organized it in chronological order, labeled with small adhesive tabs. Sandra took the folder, set it flat on her desk, and went through it page by page without speaking. It took her 11 minutes. When she finished, she closed the folder, set her pen down, and looked at him. "Tell me about the gun," she said. He told her, calmly, in the same order it happened. The open bedroom door, Adrienne's face moving through those 3 expressions, the nightstand drawer, the angle of the barrel, the words she said, the words he said. He did not editorialize. He described it the way he would describe a structural failure, component by component, in sequence. Sandra listened without interrupting. "Under Georgia law," she said when he finished, Pointing a loaded firearm at a person while issuing a verbal command to leave constitutes aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. That is a felony. Minimum 1 year, up to 20. Desmond nodded slowly. The police report you filed that same afternoon is one of the smartest things you have ever done. She tapped the folder. It is time-stamped before any divorce proceedings, before any attorney letters, before she had a chance to build a different version of what happened in that room. It is clean, and it is yours. She paused. Do you want to press charges now? No, Desmond said. She studied him for a moment. Good. Because right now, it is more valuable as a loaded weapon than as a filed charge. She almost smiled at the phrasing. You hold it, you keep it ready, and when the exact right moment arrives, when she or her attorney tries to position her as a victim of this process, you activate it. The charge neutralizes everything she tries to build against you. Instantly. Desmond said nothing. He understood the logic completely. It was the same principle he applied to any structure under load. You didn't release the tension until the moment the release served you best. Sandra moved through the rest of the folder with the same efficiency. The $41,000 in transfers, the LLC, the procurement contracts, Adrienne's signature on both, Brett's investment entity connected to the vendor. The hospital matter, she said, I will handle separately and carefully. There are proper channels for flagging a potential financial conflict of interest to a board. Anonymous, institutional, through the right administrative contacts. I will make sure the right people have the right information. She looked up. I will not be doing anything improper. I will simply be ensuring this does not disappear into a drawer somewhere. That's all I need, Desmond said. She scheduled their next appointment, stood, and shook his hand with a grip that was firm and brief and meant something. He was at the elevator before she called after him. Mr. Wade, he turned. Don't contact her. I know, he said. Adriana noticed the storage unit first. She had driven out to the facility on a Thursday afternoon, a key she had never bothered to return on her keyring, telling herself she just wanted to know what was in there. She had always known Desmond kept documents in the unit, tax records, property files, financial paperwork. She had never paid close attention to exactly which documents. The key did not work. The lock had been changed. She stood in front of the orange roll-up door for a moment, then got back in her car and drove home. The following Monday, she called their financial advisor, a man named Gerald, who had managed their joint investment portfolio for 4 years. The call went strangely from the first minute. Gerald was polite, but careful in a way he had never been careful before, choosing his words with a precision that felt deliberate. He mentioned twice that Desmond had come in recently for a personal account review. When she asked a direct question about the joint account's current balance, Gerald told her, gently, that he had been asked to direct those inquiries through individual consultations only, and that she was welcome to schedule one. She ended the call and sat very still at her kitchen table. She texted Desmond, "Can we please talk? I just have some questions about the accounts." He replied 4 hours later, "Working." That was it. One word. Brett called a man named Calvin Hughes that same week. Calvin had known Desmond since their junior year of college, one of those friendships built on shared history and the kind of mutual respect that does not require regular contact to remain real. Brett framed it casually, just trying to get a sense of where Desmond's head was at. Calvin was quiet for a second. "You want my honest read?" Calvin said. "Yeah. Don't mistake quiet for soft. That man doesn't get loud." A pause. "He gets even." Brett thanked him and hung up. He turned his phone face down on his desk and leaned back in his chair, thinking it through. A structural engineer from Memphis who made polite conversation at hospital galas. A man who had walked backward out of his own bedroom without raising his voice. He dismissed it. That night, Desmond sat on the edge of the hotel bed with a yellow legal pad balanced on his knee. At the top of the page, in his own handwriting, he had written 2 words, "What I want." Below it were 5 lines. He had written them the first week, when everything was still raw, and the weight of it had not yet converted itself into something useful. He read them now the way he read a completed checklist, not with feeling, just with attention. He drew a line through the first, then the second, the third, the fourth. He looked at the 5th. She needs to know I knew everything. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he set the pen down and turned off the light. Desmond called Sandra at 8 in the morning. "File it," he said. "I'll have the papers served by 2 o'clock, she said. He hung up and went back to his coffee. Adrienne was in a budget review meeting when her assistant knocked twice and opened the door. The woman's face was carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering something they don't fully understand but sense is significant. She handed Adrienne a sealed envelope and said a process server was waiting in the lobby for confirmation of receipt. Adrienne signed for it. She did not open the envelope at the table. She waited until the meeting ended, walked to her office, closed the door behind her, and sat down. Then she opened it. She read the first page twice. She called Desmond. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She set the phone down, picked it back up, and called a 3rd time. On the 4th ring, she heard the click of the call connecting and felt something loosen in her chest. And then she heard his voicemail recording begin. The same calm, unhurried voice she had lived beside for 9 years, asking her to leave a message. She didn't. She called Uncle Lawrence instead. He picked up on the 2nd ring. "Lawrence." Her voice was measured, controlled. She had always been good at controlled. "I need you to talk to Desmond. I need you to tell him that we can handle this privately, that there's no reason to involve courts or attorneys if we can just—" "Adrienne," Lawrence said. She stopped. "Don't call this number again." The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand for a full minute. Outside her window, the Atlanta skyline held its shape, indifferent and gleaming. She put the phone face down on her desk and began to think. By the end of that week, a version of events had started moving through their social circle. Adrienne had always been good at this, at shaping a room before anyone realized the room was being shaped. She reached out to 3 women she trusted and told the story carefully. Desmond had been erratic, distant. She had been frightened. The girls' trip that weekend, the one she had mentioned to him the morning he came home early, she reframed it as an attempt to give them both space after weeks of tension. She had feared for her safety. She said it twice to each person, in slightly different language, the way you do when you want something to feel like it came from somewhere deep. She did not say anything about the gun. Pat heard the version on a Saturday afternoon at a birthday lunch for a mutual friend. One of the women at the table, someone who had known Adrienne from a professional women's group, mentioned it almost in passing, the way people mention things they believe they already understand. Apparently it got bad. She was scared of him. The table made small, sympathetic sounds. Someone shook their head. Pat picked up her glass and took a slow sip. She did not say a word, but she remembered every word that had been said. Brett learned about the divorce filing from Adrienne on a Thursday evening call. He listened through her explanation, the served papers, the Lawrence call, the social narrative she was building, and he said the right things. He used the right tone. But that night, he called his attorney. He had a malpractice suit already working through the system, a case from 18 months ago involving a surgical complication that his legal team had been managing quietly. His reputation in the Atlanta medical community was a carefully maintained structure. He was not going to let that structure absorb whatever Desmond Wade had assembled and was now preparing to release. He began making himself less available, answered Adrienne's calls on a delay, kept his responses short. He told himself it was practical. He did not examine it further than that. The countersuit letter arrived at Sandra's office on a Tuesday morning. Adrienne's attorney was floating a claim for emotional distress, framing Adrian as the aggrieved party in the marriage's collapse, citing Desmond's financial control and emotional withdrawal as contributing factors. It was a standard pressure move, designed to slow the proceedings and shift the narrative. Sandra read it once, set it down, and called the district attorney's office. The aggravated assault case was formally activated that afternoon. Adrian's attorney received the notification the following morning. Within 48 hours, the countersuit letter was formally withdrawn. No explanation offered. No further correspondence. The kind of silence that meant someone on the other side of the table had finally looked up and seen the full shape of what was sitting across from them. The next morning, Desmond rose at 5:15. He showered and dressed, pressed shirt, dark slacks, the same clean, quiet way he had always put himself together. He made a coffee in the hotel's small in-room machine, drank it standing at the window, and looked at the city coming awake in the gray early light. He packed the rest of his things in 20 minutes, checked out at the front desk, carried his bag to his truck, set it in the back seat, and laid the leather portfolio carefully on the passenger seat beside him. He had one meeting today. He started the truck and pulled out of the lot. The law office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown, neutral ground, chosen by agreement between both attorneys. The conference room had tall windows and a long mahogany table, and the kind of careful quiet that expensive spaces always have, as if the air itself had been trained to behave. Adrienne was already seated when Desmond arrived. She had dressed for this. Dark blazer, hair pinned back, the kind of put together that took real effort and was meant to look effortless. Her attorney, a trim man named Gerald Park, sat beside her with a legal pad and a posture that said he had done this 100 times and expected today to be routine. Adrienne had her hands folded on the table, composed, practiced. She looked up when the door opened. Desmond walked in first, then Sandra, his attorney, then Uncle Lawrence, carrying a flat leather briefcase and wearing the quiet, settled expression of a man who had already seen the ending of this meeting and found it satisfactory. Adrienne's eyes moved to Lawrence, then to the leather portfolio under Desmond's arm. Something crossed her face, too fast to name, gone before it finished, and then the composure returned. Desmond sat down across from her. He did not look at her yet. He set the portfolio on the table and opened it. Sandra handled the first 40 minutes. She was methodical about it. No dramatics, no raised voice, just documents, placed one at a time in the center of the table with the patience of someone who had organized this sequence very deliberately and was going to honor every step of it. The bank records came first. 22 months of transfers from the joint savings account, each one printed and highlighted in yellow, always under $900, always on a Friday, always routed to the same destination. Lawrence had prepared a single summary sheet that showed the full picture at a glance. $41,000 moved out of the marriage in increments small enough to avoid flags, but consistent enough over time to be undeniable. Gerald Park leaned forward to read it. He made a note on his legal pad. His expression was still professional, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Then, the LLC documentation, the registration in Adrienne's maiden name, the business address matching Brett Holloway's medical practice. Brett's name listed as a consultant, with 4 figures in quarterly fees paid across 18 months. Sandra set each page down with the same unhurried precision. Then the procurement contracts, then Pat's compiled timeline, printed, tabbed, cross-referenced across 12 pages, showing the thread connecting the consulting fees to the hospital supply vendor, the vendor to Brett Holloway's investment portfolio, the vendor's contract to Adrienne's direct signing authority. Pat had color-coded it. Red for the transfers, blue for the LLC activity, green for the procurement chain. It was the kind of document that made everything plain at once, and it sat in the center of that mahogany table like something that could not be taken back. Gerald Park stopped writing on his legal pad. Adrienne's hands were still folded, but her knuckles had gone tight. Sandra mentioned the hospital's federal funding structure, the implications for the procurement irregularities, the referral that had already been submitted to the appropriate channels, the nature of the inquiry that was now formally open. She said it without emphasis. She did not need to. Gerald Park set his pen down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Desmond spoke. He had not said a word until now. He looked at Adrienne directly, for the first time since the bedroom. His voice was low and even, the same voice he used on job sites when he was explaining something that had gone structurally wrong and needed to be understood before anything else could move forward. "The hospital board referral went in 11 days ago," he said. "The LLC has been flagged by the state. The aggravated assault charge is active. Your attorney already knows what a felony charge does to a countersuit, which is why that letter got pulled." He paused. "You know all of that now." Adrienne said nothing. Her jaw was set. "What you don't know," Desmond said, "is that 3 months before I came home early that Tuesday, I had already found the first transfer." The silence in the room changed quality. "I noticed it in January," he said. $900. I thought it was a mistake. I checked again in February, then March. By April, I had pulled every account we share, and I had started documenting." He set his hand flat on the portfolio. "I changed my life insurance beneficiary in May. I removed you from my 401k in June. I had already retained Lawrence by the time summer ended." He let that sit for a moment. "Every dinner we had, every morning you kissed my cheek, every time you told me you were working late." His voice did not waver. "I was already building this." He looked at her, not with anger, not with grief, with something quieter and more complete than either. "You had a plan for when I caught you," he said. "So did I." He closed the portfolio. "Mine was better." Adrienne's attorney cleared his throat. "I'd like to request a brief recess to confer with my client." Sandra looked at him pleasantly. "We're going to keep going, Gerald." The consequences did not arrive all at once. They came the way water finds its way through a cracked foundation. Quietly at first, then steadily, then all at once, with a force that could not be stopped and could not be reversed. Each one closed a door. Each one locked it behind her. The assault charge resolved on a Thursday morning in October. Adrienne stood before a Fulton County judge in a gray blazer and accepted a plea to simple assault. A misdemeanor, the felony dropped in exchange for her cooperation and a clean prior record. The judge read the terms into the court record without ceremony. A fine of $1,200, mandatory completion of a 12-week anger management program, and a firearms safety course, surrender of the weapon, 3 years of probationary reporting, and a guilty plea. Permanent, public, attached to her name in every database that mattered, retrievable by any employer who ran a standard background check, which every hospital, every healthcare system, every credentialing body in the country did, without exception, as a condition of hiring anyone for a role involving institutional trust. Her attorney had told her the plea was the best available outcome. He was right. It was still the end of the professional life she had spent 15 years constructing. The hospital had not waited for the plea. Her administrative leave had gone permanent 6 days after the mediation session, the moment the hospital's legal team confirmed that a sitting senior administrator was facing an active aggravated assault felony charge. The board did not deliberate long. The vote to terminate for cause was unanimous, and the paperwork was clean and swift. The kind of institutional action that happens when an organization is relieved to have a clear and defensible reason to do what it already wanted to do. The termination letter arrived by certified mail. Adrienne signed for it herself. The state's civil investigation into the procurement irregularities took longer but ended just as completely. 4 months after the mediation session, Adrienne agreed to a consent decree with the state attorney general's office. Partial restitution, a number that took most of what remained after the divorce settlement, stripped the marital assets. A 7-year ban on serving in any fiduciary administrative capacity at any hospital or healthcare facility operating in the state of Georgia. She was managing federal probation on one side and the state consent decree on the other. 2 law firms billing her simultaneously. The fees did not stop when the cases closed. By February, she was doing entry-level medical billing for a small physicians group in Chattanooga, 90 miles away, under a version of her name that still came up searchable if you knew what to look for. She had told the office manager she was relocating for personal reasons. The office manager had not asked follow-up questions. Brett's unraveling moved on a parallel track and took longer, but it was no less complete. When the hospital subpoenaed Brett's financial records in connection with the procurement investigation, the lawyers who reviewed them found something the subpoena had not specifically been looking for. A pattern of insurance double billing, claims filed twice for the same procedure under different administrative codes, routed through 2 separate billing entities Brett had structured years before the affair began. It was not connected to Adrienne. It was entirely his own. It had been running for 6 years. Pat had spotted it first, buried in the 3rd tab of the financial production. She flagged it to Sandra, who had a professional obligation to refer it, and did. It went to the state medical board, then to a federal healthcare fraud unit. Brett's 2 practice partners retained separate counsel within a week of the referral becoming known and announced they were dissolving the partnership. They were not going to share a practice or a headline with a man whose billing records were now in federal hands. They were gone inside of 3 months. Brett surrendered his admitting privileges at 2 Atlanta-area hospitals while the investigation was active. Without admitting privileges, he could not perform the orthopedic surgeries that had made him wealthy. His malpractice insurer dropped him at their next policy renewal date. Without coverage, he could not practice even if the privileges returned. The practice dissolved formally in December. His personal and business accounts were frozen during the federal investigation. His attorneys, plural now, because the medical board matter and the federal matter required separate representation, billed him a combined $300,000 over 14 months to keep him out of a federal prison. They succeeded, narrowly. The case resolved as a civil consent decree, a substantial financial penalty, 5 years of active medical board monitoring, and a formal agreement to restructure his billing operations under third-party oversight. He was not in prison, but the Porsche was gone, sold during asset liquidation before the freeze lifted. His name in the Atlanta medical community meant something different now than it had meant 2 years ago. The city was small enough, and the story was specific enough, that everyone who mattered already knew. Desmond read the finalized divorce settlement on a Tuesday evening in the corporate apartment his firm was covering while he transitioned between projects. It was 31 pages. He read every one. The marital assets divided in his favor. The $41,000 in marital theft accounted for in the settlement terms. His retirement intact. His accounts clean. He signed at the bottom of the last page, set the pen down, set the document aside. Then he opened his laptop and booked a one-way flight to Houston. 14 months later, Houston was just waking up. Desmond stood on the balcony of his second-floor apartment with a mug of coffee and watched the city come to life below him. The air was warm already, even at 6 a.m. That thick Gulf Coast warmth that settled on everything like a hand. Traffic was beginning to build on the street below. A woman walked a dog. A delivery truck idled at the corner. The city did not know his name, did not know his history, did not know anything about him except that he paid his rent on time and kept his balcony clean. He liked it that way. Pat was in town for a project management conference downtown. She texted him Wednesday morning. "Free for lunch tomorrow?" He replied within the minute. "Yes." You pick the place. She picked a quiet Cajun spot 3 blocks from her hotel. Small tables, good food, the kind of place where you could have a real conversation without raising your voice. They arrived at the same time. She looked the same. Sharp eyes, practical clothes, the particular kind of calm that belongs to people who are good at their work and know it. They ordered, caught up on the firm, on a bridge project he had been consulting on a mutual colleague who had finally gotten the promotion he had been waiting 3 years for. Normal things, easy things. Then Pat set down her water glass and said, "You want to know how they're doing?" It wasn't really a question. Desmond looked at her. "Tell me." She pled guilty to the assault charge in March, Pat said. Misdemeanor, fine, and a class. He nodded. He already knew the legal outcome. Sandra had called him when it resolved. But hearing it from Pat made it land differently. More real, more final. "She's doing billing work in Chattanooga," Pat continued. "I heard it through Renee, who heard it from someone at the hospital. Nobody said it unkindly. It was just information." Desmond turned his glass slowly on the table. He didn't say anything. "Brett was at a medical licensing hearing last month," Pat said. "Someone I know from the forensic accounting world was there for something unrelated. She recognized him, said he came in wearing an off-the-rack suit, sat in the back, didn't talk to anyone." Pat paused. "She said he looked like someone who used to be someone." The table was quiet for a moment. Desmond set his glass down, looked out the window at the street. "She had that gun in the drawer before I ever walked through that door," he said. Pat nodded slowly. "I know. She planned for me." He said it without heat, without bitterness. Just the plain fact of it, examined in the light. She just planned wrong. Pat didn't fill the silence after that. She understood him well enough to know he didn't need a response. He needed the space to say it out loud and let it be true. They finished lunch talking about Houston, about the new project, about where to get good food, and whether the summers were as brutal as people claimed. By the time they hugged goodbye on the sidewalk, something felt settled. Not resolved, settled. There was a difference, and Desmond had learned it. Lawrence called that evening just after 7. "Just checking in," he said. That was always how he started. They talked for 20 minutes. The new project. A cousin's wedding in Memphis in the fall. Lawrence's garden, which he had expanded to include tomatoes this year. Then Lawrence said, "You eating well out there?" Desmond smiled. "Yes, sir." "Good," Lawrence said. "A man who eats well is a man who's at peace." After they hung up, Desmond stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he walked back out to the balcony. The city had shifted into its evening rhythm. Lights came on in the buildings across the street. The traffic below had thinned. Somewhere a few blocks away, someone was grilling something, and the smoke drifted up, faint and sweet. He thought about the park bench in Atlanta. He thought about that first hour, sitting alone with the full weight of what he had just seen, what he had just understood, the way everything in him had wanted to come apart. The choice he made, quietly and deliberately, to be precise instead of reactive, to treat it like a problem with a structure, to find the failure points, to move toward a solution. He thought about standing in the doorway of his own bedroom and saying 7 words to a woman who was pointing a gun at him. He hadn't known then. He hadn't known he already had everything he needed to survive it. The discipline that wouldn't let him panic, the patience that wouldn't let him rush, the quiet that everyone around him had spent years mistaking for something smaller than it was. He knew now. Desmond went inside. He sat down at his desk. He opened his notebook to a clean page, uncapped his pen, and wrote the first line of the next thing he was building. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.